Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. Just to start off with, I just wanted to say again that we, of course, are on the land of the Kaurna people, and I would like to pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Annabelle Quince, and I host a current affairs program on Radio National called Revision. Thanks. After the October 7th attacks last year, I made a program with several historians and journalists, and we looked at the history of the Gaza Strip. The program provoked quite a large response, but we expected that. But what I hadn't expected was how many listeners objected to one of my guests, Professor Ilan Pappé. Professor Pappé was not particularly controversial and had written extensively about the history of Gaza. And then it struck me that why he elicited such a strong response is because he challenges some of the founding myths on which the State of Israel is created. And we here in Australia know a little bit about founding myths because we non-Indigenous Australians were very slow at denying our founding myth, which was terra nullius. And it really wasn't until the Mabo court case in 1992, 204 years after the arrival of the First Fleet, that lie finally came to an end. And it's only now that we're starting to see the stories of the frontier massacres and violence emerging into the mainstream, as we heard yesterday with David Marr. Professor Pappé has spent a good part of his academic career examining the period of the British Mandate in Palestine. He has challenged the idea that the over 700,000 Palestinians displaced when Israel was created went willingly. And he continues to challenge the logic behind Israel's idea of national security. Ilan has been and remains a dissident voice in Israel. And in this session, I'd like to talk to him about where that voice actually comes from. Ilan is Professor of History and Director of the European Centre for Palestine Studies at Exeter University, and his books are too numerous to mention, but they do include The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of the Occupied Territories, The Forgotten Palestinians, A History of Palestinians in Israel, and his biography, Out of the Frame, The Struggle for Academic Freedom in Israel. So, Ilan, I want to start, I suppose, with your story, because your parents were German Jews and were part of that first wave of European Jews that actually went to the British mandated part of Palestine. And I'm just wondering what motivated them in the 1930s to go there, and just how typical they were of the Jews that arrived in the British Mandate of Palestine in that period.
Hi. Good afternoon to all of you, and I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person. And it's a great honor to be on the East stage once again. Thank you. My parents came in what was probably the third or the fourth wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine in modern times. As you know, the first wave started in 1882. My parents came in the 1930s, and they came from Germany. The German Jewish immigration to Palestine was a bit different from the waves before that. The two waves before that came from mainly Central and Eastern Europe were by ideological Zionists, if you want, people who believed that they were not only coming to a better place, but to a place of their own, and were motivated by the idea that they are redeeming an ancient homeland that was theirs. Jews in Germany, where they could. Unfortunately, at the time that my parents had decided that Germany was an unsafe place for Jews, really in the last moment, they left after Hitler came to power. At that time, Britain, the United States, quite a few countries already closed their doors for Jews who wanted to find refuge in these countries. My father's brother was very lucky that his wife was appointed or was hired by a very important New Zealander family, and they were able to go to Christchurch. But my father wasn't that lucky. So they came to Palestine as refugees more than anything else, because Palestine was in many ways the only open destination in that particular moment in history when Nazism and fascism was on the rise in Europe.
So in essence, it's really important to understand this. It was an incredibly important place of refuge, wasn't it?
It was indeed, and the British allowed a relatively large number of Jews to enter Palestine, and for some of them, this was definitely something that saved their lives, given the fact that they came from Germany or other areas which were occupied by the Nazis. But of course, we always have to ask ourselves when we come as life seekers to another place, that we come as guests, and we have to be thankful that there is a place that can become a safe haven. Unfortunately, even my parents very soon were integrated into the Zionist community, which means they didn't see themselves very soon after they arrived only as refugees who were lucky to find a safe place, but as part of a nation that justifiably took over a homeland that belonged to it because they used to live there 2,000 years before. So you become, if you want, and I think maybe there's something in Australian history for some people as well there. You come from a refugee, you become from a refugee, from a refugee you turn into a colonizer. And that's a kind of a different role you play in history, or in the history of the native indigenous people of the place to which you've immigrated to.
You've argued in your work, you make an important distinction between Judaism, the religion, and Zionism, the ideology. And I think that's a kind of really important distinction to be made, and one that sort of frames a lot of what happens, I guess, as time goes on in Israel. And I'm wondering if you could explain that distinction for us.
Yes, I think it's very, very important because, as you probably know, it also leads to the equation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and that's why this distinction is so important. And it is important to mention always that you cannot explain the difference always in a soundbite. You need some sort of space to make sure that the distinction is clear, and too often people who are embroiled in this debate whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism do not leave any space for a proper discussion on this. So Judaism is a faith, it's a religion, one of the three monotheistic religions existing for thousands of years, and people who believe in that religion do not have a particular national identity. In fact, they can be of any other nationality, and this is mainly a tract between the faithful and God, or between the faithful and themselves. Zionism is an ideology that interprets Judaism in a certain way in the late 19th century for political purposes. Now, it's not the only ideological movement in the world that took a monotheistic religion and turned it into an ideology in order to push forward political interests. In Islam, we have quite a few movements that are using Islam in order to justify either occupation, the creation of a state, and in some extreme cases, also terrorism. In Christianity, we have several movements in the United States and elsewhere of people who interpret Christianity as an ideology, not only as a religion, and that could be an ideology of supremacy, could be an ideology of socialism in Christianity and in Judaism, as well as in Islam. These interpretations can bring you to the left politics, or to right-wing politics, to colonialism, and even to anti-colonialism. In the history of Zionism, some of the anti-Zionist Jews were interpreting Judaism as the kind of religion that pushes them to oppose to the colonization of Palestine and to oppose to Zionism and support the Palestinians. So we have to make sure that we understand that this is not about religion. This is an ideology that, for various reasons that we might have time to go into it, decided in the 19th century to redefine Judaism, not as a religion, but as a national movement. And once they decided that the only place for this national movement to thrive was Palestine, it became not just a national project, it became also a colonialist project.
And you were born literally 6 years after the creation of the State of Israel. And I'm just wondering what you knew growing up, what you were told about the city where you grew up, the town where you grew up. Like, did you have an understanding that that area had once been Palestinian land, or were you integrated with other Palestinians? Like, what did it look like when you were a small kid?
Yes, sorry. I had a very conventional Israeli Jewish childhood when I was born in 1954 in Haifa, which meant I had very few opportunities to meet Palestinians. The Israeli educational system is segregated up to the level of the academia. You do begin to meet more Palestinians if you go to the university, but until you finish the high school system and then, like most Israeli, you join the army, your chances of meeting Palestinians are very, very few, very rare. Haifa in particular was a segregated city. I was born on Mount Carmel, and the geography and topography in Haifa corresponds or correlates also to the ethnicity in the city. The Jews, like my family, lived on the top of the mountain, and the Palestinians lived in downtown Haifa. There was no way I could have known what happened in my city during 1948 from my teachers in school, from my family, from my friends. It had to wait until I decided to become a professional historian and was beginning to establish more intimate relationship with Palestinians that the history of my own city became clearer to me. I can give you just one simple example. At the center of downtown Haifa, there is a piazza called the Liberation Square. And I always thought that this was a very apt name for a square because it celebrated Israel's liberation from British rule. It's only after I found out what happened in Haifa in 1948 that the name Liberation Square became a bit more cynical in my eyes, given the fact that it was not, Haifa was not liberated from the British, but got rid of its, almost all of its Palestinian citizens or dwellers in 1948, 75,000 in number.
When you were about 13, the other major change that happened, of course, with the Six-Day War in 1967, and then Israel, in a sense, becomes the occupying power over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Did you have a sense there of what that meant for Israel, or what that meant in terms of the number of Palestinians that were being kind of brought within the Israeli orbit?
No, I'm afraid at the age of 13, I was still very much under the influence of the Zionist indoctrination. It is true that in 68, 69, it was quite easy for Israeli Jews to go and explore the West Bank in the Gaza Strip. The boundaries were open. And I remember going with my family quite often to both places and almost feeling like I'm visiting a country abroad. But you have to understand how indoctrinating the Israeli educational system is. It's very, very unlikely for a teenager Israeli Jewish boy to find a way of, definitely in the 60s, late 60s, to find a way of challenging the narrative that he or she hear in school or from the radio or later on from television. So no, I was not at all aware. We went on these kind of organized tours into the West Bank We met Palestinians as vendors, as traders, but of course, not as people who belong to a different nation or people who were occupied and so on. All of that had to wait for an hindsight realization when later on, when both my professional and political views gelled into a far more cohesive point of view.
So can you explain that? When did you start to, because you said you grew up with a very kind of traditional view of what Israel was and your part in it. So when did that start to change? When did you start to question some of those beliefs that you were actually brought up with?
Yeah. Well, it was not a moment of epiphany. It was a trajectory. It was a journey. But I think it started in the early 1980s. First of all, there was this, by 1980, I finished my undergraduate studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I found history as an appealing topic as an academic, and I really wanted to become a professional historian. And I thought of continuing to postgraduate studies, namely to do a doctorate. And by chance, not out of any particular strategic ideas, I thought that it would be good to continue my postgraduate studies outside of Israel. And I went to the University of Oxford in England, deciding to look at 1948, which I thought was a formative history year. There was also a mundane reason for me to choose 1948 as a topic for my dissertation. Israel and Britain, the United States, the United Nations, all followed a 30 years declassification rule, which meant that at the time that I was doing my PhD, new documentation about 1948 were open, and it was clear to me as a new historian, that is a young historian, that I would be able to see documents that nobody has seen before me, which is a very good thing for a doctorate. Also by chance and not by planning, I had an Arab supervisor in Oxford, the late and great Albert Hourani. Being supervised by someone who was not just an Arab scholar, he came from Lebanon, but someone who also represented the Palestinians in the 1940s in various inquiry commissions, working on 1948 through documentation, not through narratives and stories, and doing it outside of Israel at the time when Israel in 1982 invaded Lebanon. All of this together, I think, created a great, in my mind, created a challenge in a very fundamental way the narrative I grew upon. The documents I saw in the archives told a very different story from the one I knew about 1948. The Israeli behavior in 1982 in Lebanon sounded relevant to what I began to see in the documents that happened in 1948, and being able to be in a more reasonable relationship with Palestinians on equal footing in Oxford enabled me to understand much better the other side's perspective of what happened in 1948. The PhD was quite a mundane, I think, tame thesis in my eyes, in which I was writing what I found in the documents. It only when I came back to Israel, I understood that for the Israelis, this dissertation was a huge challenge to what they claimed happened in 1948. So these 4 years of starting a professional career, doing it outside of Israel, becoming more aware of the Palestinian side, all together began a journey outside of the Zionist tribe, if you want, or ideology. And at a certain moment, but that would come a bit later, there was a moment of no return, where you are at peace of yourself, with yourself, and you think that what you know is validated and substantiated by your research, and what you believe should happen is based on your own moral perceptions of what is right and what is wrong.
Well, you came back to Israel in 1984 to the University of Haifa, and a lot of things happened. 2 years later was the first Lebanese war. 3 years later was the first Intifada. So it was a time of great tension. And I'm wondering, what did that mean for your relationship or your understanding of the relationship between the Israeli state and Palestinians? Because clearly a lot of your attitudes had shifted while you were away doing your PhD. So what did that mean when you actually came back in terms of how you perceive those events that kind of exploded really in the end of the 1980s?
Yeah. Well, one thing that happened after I came back was I was drawn also into politics and even started to thinking of maybe being involved not just in academia but also in politics. At first within some left Zionist parties, but very soon I found that ideologically I feel more comfortable among the Arab parties in Israel or the Palestinian parties in Israel, and especially in one party that was basically the Communist Party of Israel, but also had a front to which I belong for people who were not necessarily communists, but believed in this idea of an Arab-Jewish equality within the state of Israel, and also recognize the rights of the Palestinians for self-determination and independence. So the involvement in politics through the eyes of the Palestinian minority in Israel enabled me even to understand better what happened to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, to understand much better the nature of the Israeli rule in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the life experience of the Palestinian refugees outside of Israel in the refugee camps. I began intensive research, but also intensive network of connections. And also my Arabic became much better throughout that. And without Arabic, you cannot really understand the Palestinian side if you want to be part of an attempt to change the relationship between Arabs and Jews in historical Palestine. And what I did understand, and it took some time, and some friends in Australia who were working on settler colonialism at the time also helped me to understand that really the problem in Palestine was not an issue of two national movements fighting each other, and therefore all you have to do is find a peace camp in one side, a peace camp on the other side, and let the two peace camps hopefully lead the two sides into a better future, but rather that you had a settler colonialist situation, which means you don't have to look for a peace camp. What you have to look for is decolonization, the end of colonization. Because colonization, which is an organic part of Zionism, means that the Palestinians cannot ever be treated as equals. At best, they can be tolerated to have some small part in their own homeland. At worst, they should not be there altogether. And if they resist the idea that their homeland should become a Jewish state, then they have to be removed by force, oppressed, defeated militarily, and whatever. And this kind of realization that this is the situation I was living in, namely not a national conflict between two equal sides, but I'm in the midst of, which was quite abnormal, to be in the midst of a colonialist situation in the late 20th century. I always thought about colonialism as something that ended in the 1950s with the disintegration of the empire. And there I was finding myself being part of the colonialist society, still practicing, not myself, that society still practicing colonialism, and more I identified with the victims of that colonialism. And that, of course, leads you to a direct clash with your own society, your own family, and not surprisingly, it doesn't take too long in a place like Israel that from becoming a legitimate voice who doesn't agree with everyone, you become very quickly a traitor.
And what did that mean in terms of what you felt about or how you saw the Oslo process? Because in essence, that was taking almost, two nationalist ideas and trying to put them together into two different states. So did you feel that was a process that ever had a possibility of working?
Well, I had a very intimate relationship with the Oslo Accord, so to speak. At first, I was recruited, despite of my beginning of being more anti-Zionist in the way I wrote and talked. Nonetheless, I was asked to join in the very beginning the ideas of Oslo, and very soon. So I was privy to some of the internal Israeli discussion that ignited the Oslo process. And I was aware from the very beginning, and that's why I left the whole team, that this is not an genuine Israeli attempt to reach peace. It is an Israeli search for replacing one form of occupation and substitute it with a cheaper one and a more, if you want, legitimate kind of occupation. And at that time, I already knew some leaders also in the PLO, including Yasser Arafat, and like my good friend and mentor, the late Professor Edward Said, we were feeling, and some of us talked to Arafat directly, that this is a bit of a trap rather than a genuine reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians. And it was not easy to see it like this, because there was something very dramatic and appealing by the fact that eventually you will see the chairman of the PLO, shaking the hand of the Israeli prime minister. There was certainly a histrionics that you could not ignore, almost saying to yourself, don't you hear, the wings of history happening? But once you went into the details and also to the mechanism of the whole process, you understood that this was just another version of all the previous American attempts to achieve peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And whether these were genuine or cynical attempts, it doesn't matter. They were totally based on a distorted set of assumptions. And the main assumption was that in order to have peace in historical Palestine between Israel and the Palestinians, wherever they were, you had to find out what is the best Israel is willing to offer to the Palestinians and force the Palestinians to accept it, which means nobody was, and that was true about the Oslo Accord as well, nobody was willing to hear what the Palestinians wanted. All they wanted to hear, whether they were Americans or Norwegians or mediated in Oslo, they wanted to hear whether the Palestinians are willing to accept the best that Israel can offer. And the best that Israel could offer as a colonialist project was something that even the most feeble Palestinian leaders, even the most forthcoming Palestinians who just wanted to end the misery of living under occupation could not accept. Because the best Israel could offer in 1993 is not different from the best that Israel could offer in 2000. And of course, Israel now doesn't offer anything. But in those days, the best Israel could offer in the last decade of the 20th century, which was the last genuine attempt probably to reach an agreement, was to have a small Palestinian state over 1/5 of the West Bank, 2/3 of the Gaza Strip, with no sovereignty, with no capital in Jerusalem, with no solution for the Palestinian refugee problem, under Israeli economy, under the rule of the Israeli army and secret service. And in return, the Palestinians were asked to give a declaration that they have no more demands as Palestinians on the land of Palestine. Nobody on the Palestinian side could ever accept this. And the Palestinians were hoping that maybe some agreement would later be a bit better. But while the negotiations continued, and I could see it for myself, more Jewish settlements were built in the West Bank. More oppression of the Palestinians occurred on a daily basis in the Israeli checkpoints. More people were arrested without trial. More houses were demolished. And more Palestinians became victim to daily harassment and abuse, both by Jewish settlers and the Israeli army. And not surprisingly, Oslo ended with another uprising in 2000.
Almost at the same time as the Oslo process, I suppose, was starting to fall apart, something else emerged or sort of hit the headlines, which was the thesis by Teddy Gantz that looked at the idea that Israeli soldiers had murdered civilians in Palestinian villages in 1948 which is that very similar, or there are parallels, I suppose, to what happened here in our frontier wars. And I'm just wondering why that was so significant and the impact that had on you, I suppose, and your relationship with the Israeli state and with many of your academic colleagues.
Yes, indeed. This was something that sort of was an accumulative process, and it brought to the fore all the trouble I had with the Israeli academia and the Israeli Ministry of Education that eventually demanded from the University of Haifa to expel me. Teddy Katz was a master's student, a mature master's student, who at first attended a popular course I gave at the University of Haifa called the Nakba, which by itself made me very unpopular in the university, but I had tenure. It was not easy to tell me what to teach and not to teach.
And the Nakba being the great catastrophe, the moment in which...
Nakba in Arabic, the catastrophe, the Palestinian term for the events of 1948, right? I should have said that. And one of the assignments I gave to students is to go back to wherever they lived and find out what was there in 1948. And that put Katz on a trajectory. He came from a kibbutz, comes still, may he live long. He lives in a kibbutz called Magal, which was built on the ruins of a Palestinian village, Zeta. And he found, and his first work were actually on that particular village. Very naively, he found the survivors of the people who were expelled from that village in the West Bank and asked his kibbutz to have a meeting with them so that there could be kind of reconciliation between those who dispossessed the people and the dispossessed Palestinians. I don't have to tell you that the kibbutz thought it was insane already then by suggesting such a meeting. And then he decided to go even deeper into 48 and look at the history of what happened in 48 in 5 different villages. At that point, I suggested to him that I would not be his supervisor because I was already the bête noire of the Israeli academia, and I thought it won't do him any favors to be associated with me. So he took quite mainstream supervisors, and he looked at the history of 5 villages south of Haifa and what happened to them in 1948. In one of the villages called Tantura, he heard recurring testimonies by both the Israeli soldiers and the Palestinians of a massacre that the Israeli army committed that ended with the death of 230 Palestinians, one of the biggest massacres of 1948 that escaped Palestinian history, escaped Israeli history. Really nobody, for some reason, that particular massacre was only mentioned in some Palestinian fiction writer's work, but hardly in the work of historian. And then he also found documents in the Israeli archives that substantiated his assertion that a massacre took there, very, very cruel and nasty one. Now, he got a very high remark for his thesis, because it was a very good thesis. And by chance, there was a journalist who looked at dissertations in Haifa University and published the outcome of his thesis, and then all hell broke out. Now, why did the Israeli army, the Israeli University of Haifa, the Ministry of Education attack this particular dissertation where already, myself, Benny Morris, other historians were, exposing as other massacres. In fact, we wrote about 33 massacres that happened in 1948. Some of them are even worse than the massacre that happened in the village of Tantura, south of Haifa. I think the reason that they attacked, there were 2 reasons why they decided to use all their force that eventually led to the disqualification of the dissertation. The poor guy had a heart attack because of that, and today he sits on a wheelchair because of the way the University of Haifa attacked him. And even if they now they admitted that they were wrong, they have never issued any apology to him. But in any case, they attacked him for 2 reasons. And then one, when he wrote his thesis, that a Jewish postgraduate students can write a dissertation in Israel accusing the Israeli army of a massacre in the way that the Israeli political system evolved in the 21st century, this was a tantamount or equivalent to treason. I mean, if he would have written the dissertation in 1992, 1993, I think not much would have happened. But in 2000, Israel went to the right. The whole Israeli political system became extreme, fundamentalist, fanatic, racist, and feeling that it was again at war with the Palestinians, and therefore they could not have allowed a dissertation that accused Israel of war crimes in 1948 to get such high grades. I think that's one reason. The other one is that he made a big mistake. He gave me a very, very warm acknowledgement in his dissertation. And Haifa University thought that this was another good reason to try and get rid of me, which eventually they succeeded. And I think, unfortunately, he was attacked also by his association with me, because at that time I already was, in many ways, public enemy, and the Minister of Education, in a famous speech in Israel's Days of Independence, called upon the University of Haifa to fire me. So I think, unfortunately for him, he was the wrong person in the wrong place in many ways, but really it ended with 2 strokes, if I remember now correctly, and a very good man on a wheelchair, just because he wrote empathetically what he found. And by the way, unlike me, Katz to this very day defines himself as a Zionist. And he doesn't believe that the massacre undermines his belief in Zionism. I think it should, but it didn't. But that didn't help. So it was an important lesson to anybody who thought that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, or that the Israeli academia is a place where you can practice freedom of speech or freedom of expression. You cannot challenge Zionism. You cannot challenge the Israelis' war crimes. You cannot challenge morally Zionism on Israel in the Israeli academia, and therefore one should consider seriously the complicity of this academia with the crimes of Israel against the Palestinian people.
Well, you made the point that if he'd possibly published in 1992, he may not have been attacked, that there was a shift through the 90s into the 2000s. Absolutely. Where you had the political move to the right in Israel. So explain to me, how did that happen? Because, I mean, the left had been very strong in Israel really for a long, long time. So I'm just wondering how that extreme right was able to kind of capture the political process in Israel.
I think it was an inevitable political development. The whole idea of left Zionism, which is very noble, is unattainable. You can, if you think about it, when you talk about, by the way, it doesn't matter when you talk about the left in Israel, if you're a liberal or socialist. In Israel, the left means not so much your ideas about the economic system as much as your attitude towards the Palestinians or the Arab-Israeli conflict. So if you subscribe to universal values, be it socialism or liberalism, but at the same time are unwilling to desert the ideas of Zionism, you create an impossible moral position. The best way to describe it, and I think that's why the Israeli left has totally disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore. The best way of describing it is that you come and claim to yourself, and maybe to others, that you are a liberal occupier, that you are a progressive ethnic cleanser. Recently, I could say that you're a socialist genocider. These oxymorons cannot exist. You cannot really be part of a project of displacement of the Palestinians and the replacement by the Jewish people and claim that this is being done in the names of universal values, of democracy, socialism, liberalism, it doesn't matter. And I think the Israeli electorate felt that this is really not only cheating the world, it's also cheating yourself. And what happened in 2000, it was very clear. The Israeli Jewish electorate was on a kind of a juncture in the history of Israel. And they had to make a decision whether they preferred to be in a Jewish state that inevitably has to be racist, ethnic, an apartheid state, as far as the Palestinians are, because half of the population between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean is Palestinian, and there are another millions of Palestinians, refugees waiting from the outside. So if you insist on being a Jewish state, you'll have to be a racist state, an apartheid state, or you could be a democratic state, but then you won't be a Jewish state. I mean, what the Israeli electorate understood that you cannot you cannot square the circle. You cannot reconcile ethnicity and racism in a state with universal values of equality. And the Israeli electorate decided it prefers a Jewish state to a democratic state. Yes, the left was still playing in 2000, saying, no, there's still a possibility for a Jewish democracy. There's no possibility for Islamic democracy. There's no possibility for Buddhist democracy. There's no possibility for Christian democracy. There's only one possibility for democracy, and that is democracy. And that's the only way people should live in Israel and Palestine as equal people. And I think that, unfortunately, maybe because of indoctrination, maybe because of the Jewish experience, maybe because of the Holocaust, maybe because of the manipulation of fear among the Israelis, it really doesn't matter. What matters is that the final outcome of all of this is an Israeli Jewish society that is not willing to sacrifice its supremacy, its privileges, its apartheid state for the sake of democracy. We should not be surprised that 92% of the Israeli Jews today support the Israeli genocide of Gaza. We should not be surprised. And this is not going to change, unfortunately, in the near future.
Well, I was going to say, from the 2000s on, with that move to the right, did that also mean there was, in a sense, a less dissent? Because you started to see a whole series of things happen. You see Gaza given, the Israelis pulling out of Gaza, but then a whole, I guess, cycle of violence happening with the blockade, with Hamas then lobbing bombs, with Israel responding. You've got this back and forth. And I'm wondering whether or not any discussion of peace or a different way, was that possible in Israel at all? Or was there anyone talking about different ways of structuring Israel and its relationships with Palestinians?
Well, there was always and still is among the Israeli civil society groups that are trying to think differently. And many of them are even now understanding that in order to genuinely offer an alternative to the kind of Israel that we have today, you have to think outside of the Zionist mindset and frame. But these are still very small groups and minorities, and the rest, you're right, embraced the warm consensus of the Israeli Zionist interpretation of reality in the 21st century. If you want to understand how such a consensus is being understood in Israel, you have to go to the Israeli nationality law of the summer of 2018. The Israeli Knesset, in a huge majority, passed a foundational law. We don't have a constitution in Israel, but we have constitutional laws, which really have the same status as a constitution. And in 2018, Israel declared in a constitutional law that between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, there's only one nation, the Jewish nation. This is, of course, not true, but that's by law a decree that if you are claiming to be part of a Palestinian nationalism, you are violating the Israeli law. Secondly, that the aim of Israel is to settle Jews, I would call it colonize, the law doesn't use the word colonize, but to settle Jews everywhere in the land that belongs to the Jewish people. And there are other kind of clauses that actually institutionalize the already existing apartheid in Israel, but one that was de facto, was never legalized. It is now legalized. It's not surprising that after that law, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and even the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, defined Israel as an apartheid state. And this is something that we have to understand, that of course, under such circumstances, being a dissident is even more dangerous in a way than it was in my time when I started. I think it's far more difficult for an Israeli academic today to dare and challenge. And I pay tribute to the few who still do. And the only debate we have in Israel, and as you know, we had almost a civil war before the 7th of October, was not about apartheid Israel. It was between two versions of apartheid Israel. The secular Israelis wanted a pluralistic apartheid Jewish Israel, continuing the occupation, continuing the siege of the Palestinians, continuing the discrimination against the Palestinians in Israel. And they were fighting against the more messianic religious Jews who said, no, we want Israel to be a more theocratic state, a more religious state, and even more extreme in its attitude towards the Palestinians. There is no debate in Israel about whether Israel should be a democracy. There's a debate between Israel, should it be a secular apartheid state or a religious apartheid state? And unfortunately for the Israelis, I think the religious ones are going to win in the long run.
So what impact then, from your perspective, have the attacks on October 7th actually had? Because, I mean, it was something completely different to what they had seen before. And you also had this situation that the Israeli military, who was seen to be almost, completely able to, so strong, to see it sort of disintegrate so quickly. And I'm just wondering what the impact that's had and whether that's shifted thinking at all in Israel.
Well, first of all, of course, we are too close to the event to fully understand its more long-term implications. We can only talk about the short-term implication and hope that some of them at least would not be maintained for too long. In the short term, I think two things happened in the Israeli society after the 7th of October. On the one hand, there is a total crisis of confidence in the army and in the government. It was the first time, I think, that the citizens of Israel, the Jewish citizens of Israel, are not entirely sure that what they thought was an invincible army can really always protect them, and that the government can provide them even with the most fundamental, or elementary rather, not fundamental, elementary services. This is a huge crisis that would not go away very soon. And the government of Israel, well, like many, I shouldn't say it's that exceptional, but the level of the politicians of Israel is as low as it comes, as even if a committee was looking for the worst kind of people in the society and made them ministers and politicians. We never had in Israel such a bunch of incompetent politicians, and therefore their ability to provide the services after the 7th of October is quite doubtful and will affect very much the future of Israel. So that's one reaction, this rift between the society and its leadership. And I don't want to predict, I don't know how it will unfold, but it doesn't bode very well for the cohesion of the Israeli society. And it may lead to an implosion from within the society. The second reaction is, unfortunately, it intensified the hatred, the racism and animosity towards the Palestinians, the total lack of compassion among Israelis towards what maybe some of them don't even know, but even if they did, I don't think it would matter very much, to what's going on in Gaza, which reflects their lack of compassion to what happened to Palestinians before. In the great session we had the day before yesterday, an Australian journalist said rightly that he thought that the Israelis don't see on their screen anything that's happening in Gaza. I think it's true, but I don't think it would have mattered that much if they had seen. That's the level of the dehumanization that they feel, and of course what happened on the 7th of October only accentuated it. So what you're going to have, if I sum up these two reactions in Israel, you will have still a very racist, Zionist ethnic Jewish society willing to use any means possible against the Palestinians on the one hand, but you will also have a very fragmented and disunited Israeli Jewish society that would try to carry on this. Talking to young people in Israel, I asked them, what is the vision you get from your politician for the next 50 years? And they said, well, it's clear that as Israelis, the next 50 years would be years of bloodshed and one war after the other. I think in the long term, these young people may think differently. I don't think that they would follow exactly what I believe in, but I have hope that they would understand that this is not a future, that you cannot live like this for 50 years. And there is an exit. There's a door out of it, but they are too indoctrinated to see it right now. But hopefully one day they will see it.
And look, that just leads me to my final question before we maybe get some questions from the audience. And that's, you said at that last session, which was, I think, on Tuesday, that one of your hopes was that gave you hope was the next generation of Palestinians, because you said they weren't as factionally orientated as the previous generations. But I'm just wondering, are there any young Israelis that also give you hope? Because in essence, it's going to take both sides. So I'm just wondering whether or not there are young Israelis who are starting to think differently.
Not in the same numbers as the young Palestinians that I really admire, who really have, in recent years, articulated a clear vision based on human values, universal values for a future. It's very difficult for young Israelis to develop such a view. Yes, they exist. Many of them exist outside of Israel, and maybe one day they would like to come back. But to be honest, I have to say that, because I do believe that, whether I like it or not, that the only thing that would happen in the future, and it will happen, and I hope it will not be as violent as it might be, and hopefully it would be as peaceful as I wish it to be, is a process of decolonization. We won't see a peace agreement. There won't be another historical event on the White House lawn of leaders shaking hands and saying the conflict is over. No, we will see a decolonization, a slow one. It would take 20 years, 25 years for that to happen. Now, in order to make sure that this is less violent, in order to make sure that it brings us to a better future, our hopes have to be pinned not on the colonizers' society, but on the colonized society. They should lead the way. And I think once they would lead the way, and once the world would recognize their legitimate right to lead the way, which the world doesn't today, this will influence very positively the younger Israeli generation. Right now, the Israeli younger generation, the young Israeli generation is intoxicated by indoctrination that dehumanizes the Palestinians, dehumanizes the Arabs, see military power as the only way of surviving, claiming that the whole world is anti-Semitic, and nonetheless they live in the best place in the world. I think the casualties in Gaza, the next, unfortunately, violent cycles in the north of Israel, in the east of Israel, all of that will hopefully open their minds despite the indoctrination. But the people who should lead the way of all of us, Jews and Arabs, who live between the Mediterranean and the sea, and those Palestinians who were expelled from 1948 until now and should return, we should be led by a new generation of Palestinians, and we should trust them that they can make Palestine a place that would be a paragon, that would really radiate and influence the neighboring Arab states that also need a much better future, because most of them are undergoing also the worst chapters in their own history. We need a democratic, liberated Palestine so that the Arab world, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, should also be able to deal more properly and in a more just way with its own problems and challenges.
Okay, that's a very nice way to end. We do have quite a few people who are wanting to have, we've got 5 minutes for questions, and I'm just wondering, could we make sure we ask a question and not make a statement? That'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. I understand how controversial the situation of Israel is, and my only problem is that I don't think you give any ground to be able to hear another point of view. There is another point of view which might certainly
So what is the question in there?
The question is, why does he not allow another point of view? I totally agree with the rights of the Arabs and the Palestinians, and I am heartbroken that Israel is in the situation that it is, but I don't think you gave sufficient credit to those people who hold my point of view, which is to recognize the rights of the Palestinians 100% with a different approach to you. And that is the question. Why not? If you are going to be dogmatic, then is there ever an opportunity?
I think you've asked a different point of view, but so Ilan, I would have thought that one of the things that, in you having a different voice, a dissident voice, is very much because the point of view that is often heard in Israel is one very strong point of view, and your voice is a voice that, in a sense, is to some extent a bit of a voice in the wilderness.
Well, first of all, it's also a voice in the wilderness in Australia, given the fact that there was a great effort to prevent my talks on Tuesday and today. So I can tell the lady, I'm sorry I didn't get her name, that her point of view is the one Australians listen to 24/7, reading the Australian or listen to ABC. So she should be thankful that once a year, for half an hour, she's hearing a different point of view. This is really not very ingenious of her to say that the other point of view is not heard in a place like Australia, that where Zionist narrative is the only one heard, and it's very difficult to find a free space to put a counter point of view. So there's no need for me to present the other point of view that is the hegemonic one, the dominant one. It's time to hear another point of view, even if it's once a year in a great book festival.
And I think we've got a second question.
I'm not Australian, I live in the United States. But I just want to make sure that you understand.
Thank you, Ilan, for that wonderful address. I want to ask about the popular demonstrations in Israel not so long ago, very strong ones. To see it on television, it really did look as if there was a popular uprising, if that's the term, in the direction of the better Israel, better situation. Can I just ask, do you agree with that? Where are we with that at the moment?
So you're talking about the uprisings that had to do with the changes to the way the courts were going to be
yes,
judges appointed.
The constitutional change that threatened the separation of powers in Israel. That's right.
Definitely.
That's right.
Well, I think that in an article I wrote, I described this kind of almost cold civil war that you are referring to that happened until the 7th of October, and we can see the beginning of its returning now on the streets of Tel Aviv in the last two weekends, is the war between what I call the state of Judea, the state of the settlements, which that is a certain vision of Zionism that grew in the Jewish settlements in the West Bank that wants Israel to be more theocratic, more racist, and less democratic than it is, and the state of Israel, that if you want is epitomized by the city of Tel Aviv, trying to have pluralist life, multiculturalism, and so on, but nonetheless does not offer any tangible solution to the continued oppression of the Palestinians, whether inside Israel or in the occupied territories. So I think that's a genuine clash, but it doesn't concern the Palestinians. It's about the spirit and identity of the Israeli Jewish society. But because it is not relevant to the Palestinians, the only thing that come out of this kind of internal strife is weakening the Israeli social cohesion, which I think is going to continue. And again, this should send a message to the Israelis, and whether you would love to see Israel exist or whether you want Israel not to exist, it doesn't matter. Israel is in a very precarious moment in its history. It can disintegrate even without a successful Palestinian resistance or a regional attempt to change it. It is imploding from within, and I would have taken very seriously this clash, because it shows that there are two Jewish peoples now in Israel, and the only thing they have in common is a common enemy, and the only thing that keeps them together is a war, nothing else. This is not something that could be sustained for a very long time.
And look, I'm really sorry, we've completely run out of time, and I just wanted to say that it is 3:30 in the morning in Haifa, and Ilan, I'm amazed that you can be so coherent at that hour of the morning. So can we please thank him so much for taking the time to talk to us?
Thank you very much.
He is a dissident voice, and we're very lucky that we live somewhere where we can actually hear that dissident voice. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.